Well, welcome everybody to the second annual Matthews Lecture in Byzantine Studies. This lecture series was launched last year thanks to the generosity of the Matthews brothers, not the Dave Matthews Band, the Matthews brothers, who endowed this series in honor of their father, Father Constantine Matthews, who was a Greek Orthodox priest in the area in the 1970s. He served at the local parish in South Bend and also got a master's degree at Notre Dame. And in his honor, they endowed this lecture series, which we're very grateful to host here at the Medieval Institute. And we're incredibly grateful to them for making this event possible. And this year we welcome Professor Olivier Delouis, who is a researcher at the National Center for Scientific Research, the CNRS, in Paris. And in case you don't know, this is among the most coveted positions any scholar could have, kind of lifetime research fellowship. And since 2021, he's been appointed research fellow at the Maison Française in Oxford, in charge of ancient and medieval studies. He's a former member of the French School of Archaeology at Athens, and among his other accomplishments, he's done vital work in Byzantine archaeology. He holds an MPhil and a PhD in Byzantine history from Panthéon-Sorbonne University in Paris, and an MPhil from the Paris School of Economics, another part of his life. Professor Delouis is an exemplar of the very best in the venerable tradition of Byzantine studies in France. A lifetime research appointment must come with the strong temptation to never darken the doors of a classroom ever again. But Professor Delouis has happily never succumbed to this temptation. He's frequently taught undergraduate and graduate courses at the Sorbonne, at the Catholic University of Paris, and is, in general, among the most collegial of Byzantinists around. He's contributed in untold ways to Byzantine studies projects across Europe, the UK, and beyond, and has held several administrative and editorial responsibilities, most notably for the Revue des Études Byzantines, the flagship French journal in Byzantine studies. His recent publications include collected volumes on monastic mobility, monastic daily life, and the Athos monastic archives and their reception, as well as various articles on the iconology and hagiography of the great 8th to 9th century figure Theodore the Studite. I should note Professor Delouis' interest in points of East-West religious contact and dialogue, including an illuminating article on the reception of St. Benedict of Nursia in Byzantium. Among his research projects in Oxford at the moment are the publication of a corpus of monastic sermons by Theodore the Studite, and volumes on the Byzantine archives of Hilandar Monastery on Mount Athos from the 14th century that he'll be telling us about, I think, soon. We're extremely grateful that he'll be dealing actually separately with each of these major projects during his stay with us. This evening, he'll introduce us to the work of the Athos archives, and tomorrow he'll lead a graduate student seminar on Theodore the Studite. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Delouis, whose lecture is entitled Writing Byzantine History with the Archives of Mount Athos, the Odds and Perils of Uneven Sources.
Thank you so much for this presentation, and I want to thank Alexis warmly for inviting me to present this lecture here at Notre Dame. And I'm grateful to him and to the Medieval Institute for several reasons. First, because of the prestige of your institution, which has an established reputation in humanities. Second, because living in Oxford, as you said at the moment, I have met several young ambassadors of Notre Dame, most of them former students, who made me want to know better your university. And third, because I'm very aware of the importance that Notre Dame University gives to Byzantine history, as shown by the presence of a wonderful library that I discovered today. And Byzantine history is usually too neglected in universities' curricula, even though it remains one of the keys to understanding modern history right up to the current conflict. So training students in the history of Byzantium is to give them tools to learn about another European history, and of course about the Eastern Mediterranean. I am happy, even very modestly today, to contribute to the program you offer in this field at Notre Dame. So one of the reasons this history is little known is that almost all the archives of Byzantine state have disappeared. When the Byzantine state has vanished, its documentation perished. Private records, on the other hand, are almost non-existent, especially compared to the medieval West. Some exceptions exist, such as Mount Athos in Greece, but they do not take away from the historian of Byzantium the feeling of working on bits and pieces, on secondary sources, where one would like to read primary and archival documents that have not been kept. This is why, although modest in number, the Byzantine documents preserved in the archives of the monastery of Mount Athos are by far the most extensive and most valuable body of documentation preserved from the Byzantine Empire. They account for about one-half of the entire collection of archival documents surviving from that empire, surpassing all other archives, notably those of the monasteries of Patmos and Prodromos near Cyrrhus in Greece. Unlike the other archives that concern short periods and local areas, the Athonite archives span more than 5 centuries, from the 9th to the 15th century, and they cover large parts of Macedonia and Thrace, as well as certain North Aegean islands. Moreover, these documents happen in some centuries to be our only source on society and settlements, towns and villages, on demography, economy, provincial administration, and many other subjects. This is why they can be used massively as sources for the history of the Byzantine Empire. The legitimate question that arises then is whether there could be a bias using those monastic sources, the specific filters of which we will give later. So the archives of Mount Athos have been studied since 1945 in the series called Archives de l'Athos that you can find here. I selected a volume in the library of the Byzantine Library of Notre Dame. The editing team is based in Paris in the Collège de France, which is an old institution founded in 1530, and since the beginning, the French National Center for Scientific Research, to which I belong, has given a large material and human support to this ambitious project. Let me say a word first about it. This series was initiated by Gabriel Millet, first a member of the French School of Archaeology at Athens, and a tireless traveler. Gabriel Millet visited the monastery of Athos 5 times between 1894 and 1920. During the First World War, with the help of the photographers from the French Eastern Army, he collected many photographs for his books on Byzantine art, and many photographs of archives taken in 7 monasteries. He was the first to conceive the project of a diplomatic edition of these documents, followed by historical comments and photographic plates. But only 1 volume was published, however, before the war, for the monastery of Lavra in 1937. The edition presented many shortcomings, notably because the author, German Rouillard and Paul Colomb, trained as papyrologists and not as Byzantinists, had no access to the whole documentation but only to photographs, and their commentary was incomplete. So the series was relaunched by Paul Lemerle, who published a 2nd volume in 1945. Lemerle, with Franz Dolger, established in 1951 at the International Congress of Byzantine Studies in Palermo the rules for diplomatic edition, a method that should reflect both the internal and the external characteristic of a document, as you may know, a method that is still followed today for Byzantine archives. It nevertheless took Le Merle some time to build up a permanent research team, and Le Merle's great publishing adventure would come only much later, with a new edition of the Archives of Lavra again, in 4 volumes, with no less than 174 Byzantine documents. So, without going in further details, let me just say that the Byzantine documents of 14 monasteries have been published in 23 volumes up to now. And as you will see, I will take most of my examples from a new volume, Shilanda 2, the number 25th of the series, that I co-authored with Mirjana Zivozinovic from the Academy of Science of Belgrade, and which is currently under press, just waiting for its index. I will start with a short historical overview to put the genesis of the Athos archives into their context. And this context is crucial because it can help us to assess those biases in the writing of history that we expect to uncover today. In the early centuries, the history of Mount Athos is similar to the rest of the region of Macedonia. After the apostle St. Paul visited the region in the 1st century, repeated incursions by the Goths in the second half of the 3rd century weakened the network of ancient cities in the region of Chalkidiki. Greek archaeologists have made several observations attesting to the development of the Christian faith in the following period, from the end of the 4th century until the arrival of the Slavs in the second half of the 6th century. As you can see on this map, more than 70 basilica-type churches have been identified in Chalkidiki in the late antique period, especially on the 2 peninsulas of Cassandra and Cistonia on the south. The situation would have been the same probably in Athos. This territory is less fertile and was probably less populated, but archaeologists have not been able to carry out as much research work as elsewhere in Chalkidiki for obvious reasons, that is the presence, until today, of the monasteries that have survived. However, recently a Paleo-Christian basilica has been partially excavated under the medieval church of the monastery of Vatopedi. These remains suggest that a Christian cult had existed in the same place, was discontinued at some point, and then started again in the Byzantine Middle Ages. This fits quite well with a familiar pattern of reoccupation of religious sites that is well attested elsewhere in medieval Greece, like here in Synaxis, in Thrace, where you see a Paleo-Christian church transformed in a monastery. I want to say that Mount Athos is not geographically nor religiously foreign to the evolution of late antique Greece. However, that was before any written evidence was preserved. And when the first monks, or some say a new generation of monks, later arrived on the Holy Mountain in the 9th century, Mount Athos was most probably depopulated. Again, what makes Athos so distinctive? First, it should be noted that the idea of a monastic mountain was not uncommon in Byzantium. Mount Oxentius on the Asian side of Constantinople, Mount Kiminus and Turkey's Olympus or Uludag in Bithynia, the Latros mountain near Milet and Galatia near Ephesus, the Gannon and Papikian mountains in Thrace or Varasova in Epirus, provided or would later provide similar example of groups of Byzantine monasteries, sometimes federated, set up at high altitudes and at a significant distance from secular life. Nevertheless, few of these mountains have left archival documents. In the middle of the 9th century, the monastic history of Athos emerges from the mist of time. In 843, Empress Theodora, the widow of Emperor Theophilus, invites a delegation of Athonite monks to attend the official restoration of images after iconoclasm, as we can see in a later icon of the 14th century. Later, some names attest to the existence of early monastic communities, apparently still not well organized. Around 859, St. Euphemius the Younger, around 896, St. Blasius of Amorion, visited or settled on the Holy Mountain. The place reputation was already established, and the monks lived there as hermits or in semi-anachoritic communities. The first written documents preserved are privileges given by the Emperors Basil I in 883, Leo VI around 887 or 908, and Romanus I Lecapenus in 934, quickly followed by others. In 942-43, the border that you can see on this map of the monastic peninsula was established. And today some Athonite monks considered it to be the most ancient European border preserved until today. In 972, already 56 abbots signed the famous rule or typicon which the Emperor John Zimisces imposed on all monks, a text that forbade, as you know, beardless men, women and eunuchs to access the mountain. Constantine Monomachos will update this document in 1045, and we can see here a later copy of the 12th century. In addition to this first charter of 972, 46 monasteries are attested on the Holy Mountain before the end of the 10th century, according to the analysis of other written documents. And finally, based on very few, as I said, field observation and fewer archaeological surveys, at least a dozen monasteries' ruins survive dating back to the 10th and 11th century. So this sudden growth coincided with the installation on Athos in 957 of Athanasius the Athonite, who was an orphan from Trebizond, current Trabzon in Turkey on the Black Sea, who became a professor in Constantinople and who maintained excellent relationship with the aristocratic society of Constantinople, in particular with the Phocas family. Although Athanasius did not introduce monasticism to Athos, he did propose some radical changes. The primacy of the cenobitic over anachoritic life, imperial patronage, which provided resources, and independence, particularly independence from the canonical power of the local bishop, and also participation in the rural economy by cultivating large estates outside Athos. In 963, Athanasius founded the monastery of the Great Lavra, Megisti Lavra, in the south of the peninsula, where he gathered a community of monks of various origin, including Italians, Armenians, Georgians. Athanasius was a good scholar. He was also a monastic legislator, and he endowed his monastery with three fundamental texts: a disciplinary and liturgical rule called the Hypotyposis, a foundation charter called the Typicon, and a testament, the Diatyposis. However, he came up against the reluctance of Athonite monks who preferred the ancient and eremitic way of life. And despite many setbacks, the abbot or igumenos of Lavra, thanks to his talent for organization and the unfailing support of the emperors, succeeded in giving Athonite monasticism a model that is still virtually unchanged today after more than 1,000 years. So following Athanasius, several great monasteries were founded in the 10th century, such as Iveron and Vatopedi, and others in the 11th century, which soon found themselves at the head of considerable fortunes in land. A picture that I like to show is the sign of Lavra's influence in the architecture of the triconch churches that spread across the peninsula. In any case, from the reform of Athanasius onwards, we observe in Athos precisely what Max Weber called the bureaucratization of charisma and the creation of the first archive collections. So the exceptional preservation of Byzantine archive is the first reason for which historians of Byzantium are grateful to Mount Athos. This good fortune is due to several factors, stability of the monastic foundations, legal autonomy, and to a certain extent, geographical isolation. As for their content, these immense Byzantine collections concern first and foremost the wealth of the monasteries and their movable and immovable properties. So you would not look into them for the spiritual history of Mount Athos, and I'm sorry for the theology students here. Those documents concern mainly economic and social history. The documents are monastic, but they are all about wealth and enrichment. So the imperial charters, called chrysobulls, and the imperial orders or prostagmata are the most prestigious and have received the attention of researchers from the very beginning. They show the concern of emperors who were working for the salvation of their soul, giving grants to the monks, but also who understood the importance of facilitating, using tax exemption measures, the prosperity of institutions whose economic activities impacted the region of Macedonia. So, without the monasteries of Athos, Byzantine diplomatics would be reduced to a minimum. Take those chrysobulls, those documents issued and signed in red by the Byzantine emperors with a golden seal attached, here, hence their name, chrysobull. Almost all the originals that have come down to us are preserved in Athonite monasteries. So, let's imagine we remove the Holy Mountain from Byzantine history. There would be only a few units left, perhaps 30 or so documents, especially in Patmos, rarely originals, to tell the story of 1,000 years of Byzantine chancery. A more straightforward type of Byzantine imperial documents is called prostagma or orismos. Being an administrative decree, it is usually short. By far, most prostagmata are written on paper. The prostagma is usually in a landscape format, as you can see on the right, and the emperors sign it in red, a signature called menologium, because until the 14th century, it only indicates the date. Acts written by Patriarch of Constantinople are surprisingly rare, 4% of our documentation. They are usually documents of confirmations, judgments, arbitrations, obtained during conflicts between two monasteries. However, if they are few in number, they prove to be particularly useful when compared to the famous Patriarchal Register of Constantinople. The Register of the Patriarchate of Constantinople, dated to the 14th century, is the only cartulary of the Patriarch of Constantinople that have survived in its original form. It has been transmitted in two manuscripts now kept in the Austrian National Library. And as Christian Gasgiber has shown recently, the archives of Mount Athos provide crucial evidence to establish the full list of the scribes working for the Patriarchate of Constantinople in the 14th century. One of the most striking results of his comparative study on the hands of those documents is that the scribes at the time could work either for the imperial, either for the patriarchal chancery simultaneously. State officials' documents open up the possibility of writing an administrative history of Byzantium. Without these Athonite acts, it would be, again, very difficult to imagine the functioning of a complex and efficient administration, and in the first place, the complex Byzantine tax system. The most complete documents are the Practica. In these documents, which were usually drawn up following a census, and which reproduce data contained in the tax register, the Byzantine administration described the composition of a rural estate, topographical boundaries, number of households, family structure, properties owned, in order to establish the tax base and the tax rent of an estate which is granted by the emperor to a monastery. And to date, 65 Athonite Practica have been published. And when they can be compared during time, as it is the case with 4 Practica of the Iveron monastery, dated 1301, 1318, 1320, 1341, one can make very interesting observations on the demography, or on the evolution of the standard of living of the listed families. The document drawn up by private individuals amount to 30% of all Athonite documentation, and they attest to the concern for the afterlife. For a Byzantine to be commemorated by the monks after having donated to them a land or something else is to secure a guarantee for their salvation. Therefore, this collection includes deeds of gift, sale, lease, agreements, and wills. And a significant proportion, and I will come back to this later, a significant proportion of these private documents date from a period before the acquisition of the land by the monastery, which gives a very interesting insight about the life of some well-off families of the Byzantine Empire. Another extensive category, more than 130 acts already published, concern the protos, or the first in Greek. The protos is known as early as 908. He is the highest representative of Athos. He's elected by the monks, confirmed by the emperor, and later, from 1312, by the Patriarch of Constantinople. And he has a crucial administrative, disciplinary, and judicial functions, and is assisted by several officers. He speaks to the external authorities on behalf of all the monasteries. Thanks to the preserved documents of the proti, or protoi, it is possible to understand over time the practice of self-management of the Holy Mountain, which the monks still advocate today. But of course, those documents are almost useless for the rest of the empire, since they concern mainly internal affairs. And to finish with this typology, we are sometimes lucky enough to discover famous signatures in those archives, such as that of the famous philosopher, Neoplatonist and Byzantine humanist, George Gemistos Plethon. But in general, as our team recently identified in the monastery of Shilanda, a practicon signed by a famous mathematician, Nikolaos Rabdas, the future research should consider the role of Byzantine scholars in the writing of administrative records kept on Mount Athos, and this is a very promising avenue for research. So now some statistics and the relevance of those documents for Byzantine history. In Mount Athos, thanks to this extensive documentation, we can follow the administrative work carried out in each of the 17 monasteries that have preserved Byzantine archives, so 17 monasteries. We have nearly 1,200 Byzantine documents that have been preserved in the monastery, but as you can see here, they are very unevenly distributed over time. And this is the first limit to the coherence of this collection. The 14th century alone accounts for nearly 60% of our documentation. This can be explained, but this is indeed a paradox, because in the 14th century, the Byzantine state is, whatever one may say, confronted with political tension, external threats, and a weakening of its economic resources. But still, most of the monasteries of Mount Athos were able to increase their wealth and performed economically quite well. Of the acts whose authorship is known, 28% are private. They are mainly sales acts by lay people, as I said. 70% are acts of officials and civil servants, 50% of emperor or despots, and 10% of proti. And of the acts whose type is known, 26% are deeds of sales, donation, or exchanges, 10% are chrysogold, and 6% are prostamata. So, as you can see here, there is another distortion on 2 points. The importance of land exchange, a quarter, in favor of the monasteries, and the documents issued by the emperors, 60% in total, 10% chrysogold, 6% prostamata. This draws a portrait of monasteries as religious landowners with an unusual purchasing power, where religion, not only economy or profitability, obviously plays a role, and whose relations with the imperial power are incredibly close and important. This is obviously not the portrait of a standard economic actor in Byzantium. The merchants, producers, importers, the craftsmen, the guilds, the army, the lay aristocrats and their estates, and most documents concerning women are not in the picture. And among the acts with geographical information, more than 2/3 concern Eastern Macedonia, where the monasteries possessed most of their goods. 18% Athos, 6% Lemnos, and then different regions where some monasteries had also some possessions. Obviously, again, this is not a meaningful Byzantine geography. And more precisely, of the document whose place of issue is known, 26% are coming from Thessaloniki, 21% from Constantinople, and 80% from Athos. This underlines the regional importance of the monasteries and the quality, again, of their relationship with the administration of Constantinople. But not all documents entering a monastery, in fact, were preserved, as it is today the case for almost any institution. Some documents were reused. Parchment, for instance, could be washed to write new text, or documents could be glued together to the back of fragile documents, or even as cover pages for manuscript. Moreover, after a certain period of time, we know that the documents kept were sorted according to their usefulness, some remaining at the disposal of the monastery authorities, others qualified as useless, akrista, being placed in remote archive. So there is a distinction between the living archives and the dormant archive. The name of the officers in charge of the archive in the monasteries is unknown. Outside the Holy Mountain, the archives could be under the responsibility of the cartophylax, the librarian, or the scevophylax, the treasure guard of the monastery. In Patmos, in 1091, they were under the responsibility of the ecclesiarch, whose job was to keep both books and documents. So we know a bit more about preserving the archives in the monastery of Shilandar. Around 1320, according to the Slavonic source, documents were simply stored in chests and in a bag. In a wooden chest for Chrysobru, in a tin chest for the deeds of other authorities, in a bag for the deeds of sale, and probably in an ordinary black chest for the living archives, as you can read here. So despite this quite chaotic order, this record shows at least a concern for the conservation and storage of archives. But very few inventories have been preserved, especially in Athos, where we know only two, at Shilandar around 1300, and for the monastery of Xilogu at the time of the transfer of its archive to the monastery of Rosicon in 1142. So we have very few information about how the documents were kept. Therefore, not only is the Athos archive not representative of the Byzantine economy, it is unevenly distributed geographically and over time, and important losses have to be explained. So now I would like to rely on a recent article by Rosemary Morris that we published in the collective book recently about reading the archive of Mount Athos, about the lost documents of Athos. Jacques Lefort had estimated that among the published documents of Mount Athos, there were mentions of about 450 lost documents. Let me explain this. This fact can be established thanks to the decision made by the first editors of the Archives de l'Athos series to include in their commentary to each document mentions of other documents referred to within it. They are called, in our system, actes mentionnés, document mentioned, in the editing system used by the Archives de l'Athos series. So, this is an example. In this decree, Prostagma, the Emperor Andronic II orders to the Protof of Mount Athos to return the small monastery, Kalidrion, of Skopje, to the monastery of Shilandar, or to pay back the Serbian monastery. And in order to justify his decision, the emperor refers to 6 other documents which are listed in the category of actes mentionnés of our edition. But as you can see here in red, 5 out of 6 are lost, and only 1 has been preserved. So with 1 document here, we know the existence of 6 others, but 5 are lost, although they concern the monastery itself. If some documents are just referred to, others are sometimes quoted in portions of inserted text. Let me show you another example. In this document, 2 civil servants put the monastery of Schilenda in possession of a land. And to justify their action, they are quoting verbatim a decree of prostagma of Andronic II, ordering them to do so. This encapsulated document has been preserved randomly and indirectly, but the original again is lost because it was kept in a bureau of the central administration of Byzantium, and the archives, as I said, has vanished. But we must admit, with Rosemary Morris again, that the acte mentionné, the mentioned document, may not have been accidentally lost. There was, like in our modern libraries, on top of the classification between living and dormant or sleeping archives, some weeding process. But I'm not sure we will be able to understand how and why this occurred. Again, there were no professional rules for archive management in medieval times. Archives were not kept for scholars and researchers, but for the immediate use of their owner. The management of the archives was probably better, however, in the large monastery which had competent officers than in the smaller ones. So if we assume with Jacques Lefort this time that every 10 years, all periods taken together, any monastery should receive 8 documents worthy of being more or less permanently archived, which is perhaps a maximum, but a reasonable hypothesis. The total number of documents archived would amount to about 5,300, which means that we would have kept only 25% of the documentation. It was known in Byzantium that documents also deteriorated with time, and that it was wise to copy them and to preserve them. On the one hand, copies were made outside the monastery and authenticated by an authority, often a metropolitan or a bishop, who gave them legal value. In the 10th century, copies would be authenticated by a seal, the seal of an authority. After that, we usually find a written authentication formula followed by a signature. Here, as we can see, in a copy of a chrysobull by Andronic II, signed by the protos of Athos, Isaac. But again, there is inequality among copies. Since it is mainly chrysobulls that have been duplicated, they account for 30% of the copies that are kept, but only for, as we have seen previously, 10% of the archives. And this is because those documents were prestigious and they had a greater utility, and so they have been copied more than others. Very precious to us is the fact that a quarter of the documents on Athos did not originally belong to the archives of the monasteries. They were brought to the monasteries by people who had a special relationship with one or another monastery, or they were given by an institution, for instance, on the occasion of the merger of a smaller monastery with a bigger one. This high percentage shows the easy circulation of documents in Byzantine society and opens the possibility of comparing documents produced for monks and lay people. For instance, if I take this prostagma again of Andronic III, In this document, the emperor confirms to a hieromonk, so a priest-monk, Theodosius Melissenus, his right on a monastery called St. Nicholas, known as Kaminikeia, near Ceres in Greece, with all its properties in June 1321. But in September 1321, for an unknown reason, maybe the death of this Theodosius, the monastery, which was a private institution, was given to another bigger monastery, the monastery of Shilanda. And this is how this private document came into the hands of the monastery and was preserved. Of course, it was not only the rules of the archivist that were different at the time. The monks in charge of the archives could be guilty of negligence or indelicacy, particularly with regard to the seals attached to the document. We estimate that 70% of the seals attached to Athonite documents have disappeared. It is generally difficult to date their loss, but it is likely that this loss is partly medieval and partly modern and linked to the object value, an object that someone could easily sell. And we have here a picture, a photograph found in Vitalien Laurent's archive, the Byzantinese, showing a collection of seals that were not supposed to be linked probably to the document to which they were attached. Because it is worth noticing that seals were sometimes reattached to some other documents, usually forgeries, to prove their alleged authenticity. So, the archives of Mount Athos are of tremendous importance for Byzantine history. Together with precious objects, manuscripts, and buildings, not to mention today protected nature, they are among the true treasures of Mount Athos. Without them, Byzantine history would be, of course, possible, but it would be much poorer and with many questions left unanswered. But can we really write this history of the Byzantine state when our knowledge of the central and provincial Byzantine administration rests on documents which have survived in copies far from Constantinople and mainly in the monasteries of Athos? So let us imagine a monastery with windows overlooking the city of Constantinople. We could see the city landscape, its walls and churches from a distance. We could see a few ships passing by. We could hear the occasional sound of monks caught up in the affairs of the world, moving according to their habits, which are different from those of ordinary men and women. But in the end, we would only see the empire from the window of a monastery. And this is what happened to us with the Athonite archives. The historical sources, the chronicle, the hagiographical text, literature, poetry, show other realities, but we can still dream in vain of the Venetian or to the Genoese sources. Nevertheless, our sample is far from negligible. A structuralist approach could conclude to the probable unity of the process of issuing the documents, to the identity of the language for lay people or for the monasteries, the identity of copies, probably, who were working in the same manner, if they were writing for a monastery or for lay people again, the identity of the way of transmission of those documents again. So this window is valuable because the panorama, if incomplete, offers many features that can be generalized. We can take another image, the image of a distorting mirror in which Byzantium is reflected in those sources. The historian must appreciate the view without getting too excited and strengthen the image that is given to him. At the price of this effort, he will console himself for the losses suffered by Byzantium and will finally be grateful to the imperfect archivist of Mount Athos. Thank you very much for your attention.